Part 15. Slavery worked against a national religion. Slavery was pervasive in the colonies from Jamestown on, but did it affect having a national Christianity in our Constitution? The answer is it absolutely did. But how? We need to back up a bit. Slavery was legal under Judaism and Roman rule long before Christianity. Rome fell, but Christianity continued to see slavery as a normal and morally acceptable part of life. Now, mass slavery disappeared when Rome fell, but slavery itself never died out. All the way up and through the Revolution, there was some kind of slavery practiced throughout Europe and Britain. 1,000 years after Rome fell, mass slavery reappeared in the 1400s as Europeans, in the Age of Discovery, explored and exploited Africa and discovered the New World. In the following centuries, Europeans happily strip-mined African populations, mostly to meet the New World's insatiable demand for slave labor. And all that time, neither Catholicism nor Protestantism had meaningful moral or legal issues with slavery. It wasn't even a real question. Though it was sometimes condemned, slavery was almost always legal and accepted as a normal part of society. Two Catholic examples. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V gave the Portuguese a license to enslave and traffic Africans. Later in 1490, Pope Innocent VIII accepted a gift of 100 slaves from Ferdinand II of Aragon and re-gifted them to his cardinals and Roman nobility as slaves. Don't get me wrong, the Protestants were enthusiastic slavers as well. The English House of Stuart founded the Royal African Company in 1672 with King Charles II's brother as its head. Initially, they mined gold in Africa, but they quickly pivoted to trafficking slaves, which were much more profitable. The North American colonies were no different. By 1750, every major Anglo-American Christian denomination, including the Quakers, sanctioned the institution of slavery. Jesuits, Catholics, owned slaves in Maryland as early as 1711 and didn't sell them until 1820. Jonathan Edwards, the firebrand New England Puritan preacher, owned at least 2 slaves as of 1731. Cotton Mather, the famous New England Puritan, owned slaves and argued that the law of Christianity allowed for slavery. The Reverend Francis McKemmy, the father of American Presbyterianism, owned and managed a Georgia plantation, which at the time of his death in 1708 had 33 slaves. Samuel Davies, another Presbyterian preacher, championed literacy for slaves but owned slaves himself in Virginia. George Whitefield, the famous evangelical in the Great Awakening, was instrumental in advocating for the legalization of slavery in Georgia because he owned slaves and plantations in both South Carolina and Georgia. Even Enlightenment philosophers had mixed attitudes towards slavery. John Locke, the champion of freedom of equality, in his 1690 treatises, argued that slavery was a natural and morally acceptable part of society. At its core, ownership of humans was a moral issue, and that made it a religious issue. And times were changing. Anti-slavery movements first started in the 1600s. Northern Christians and ministers were a critical part of the redefinition of slavery as morally wrong and evil. The beginnings of American anti-slavery appeared in the North and never showed up in the South as early as 1688 with the German Quaker petition against slavery. A couple of examples: Samuel Sewall, a Massachusetts judge who had judged and sentenced some of the Salem witches to death, argued against slavery in 1700, but also argued that current slaves should remain slaves. By 1743, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was proclaiming, "Give liberty to whom liberty is due, that is, to every child of man, to every partaker of human nature. Let none serve you but by his own act, by his own voluntary action." Thus, by the mid-1700s, the anti-slavery movement had become serious in the North and was beginning to be a real threat to the moral and theological basis for slavery. In response, Southern ministers of all denominations grew more hardened in their own biblical and theological arguments defending slavery. By 1787, there was a rapidly widening gap between the Christianity used by Southern ministers to justify and defend slavery and the Christianity that argued for black freedom and equality. Both sides used the Bible. Both sides claimed God and the Bible supported their beliefs. This religious split reflected how much the framers wanted a national religion in the new Constitution. The framers were creating a secular federal republic with an expansive but uncharted amount of authority to supersede state laws. Establishing a federal Christianity or any religion, no matter how generic, would open the door to religious laws about slavery. That possibility would make getting the states to approve the Constitution that much harder. Thus, the fact that slavery existed helped to keep any discussion of a national religion off the table.